let me explain my secret for drawing buildings freehand. And as is the case with most things in drawing, it's all about how we think rather than any particular skills of putting ink on the paper, because I am drawing this directly in ink. So this is a way of drawing buildings freehand with no underdrawing, no pencil at all. And the key is being able to jump between two different mindsets, and that's to be able to jump between thinking shape, seeing and thinking shape, both in the reference and in what I draw, and seeing and thinking form in the reference and in what I draw. And there's a very big difference because shape is two-dimensional. A shape is something that has a height and a width, but a form is three-dimensional. It has a height and a width and a depth. And in life, buildings are forms, they're three dimensions. But when we actually look at a photo, it's a two-dimensional object. It's a sheet of paper. And the image of the building that we see is in fact two-dimensional. We could cut every shape that we see out, and it has height and width and no depth. And so it's learning to see the form and also to see the shape and to choose which one we see at a point in time to enable us to draw as accurately as possible, which for me is the key part of the way I draw buildings freehand. So let's talk in this demo about how I'm jumping between one and the other. So I start with trying to find some simple shapes. So now I'm concentrating on shapes at the very start, almost exclusively. Height and width, and I'm trying to find, if possible, some square or rectangular shaped parts, because that's going to be easier than a more complex shape that might have more than four sides. And so I'm looking for that, and this veranda at the front is an obvious place where we see boxes, and the columns of the veranda make up the sides, and the long top makes up the top, the top of the roof, and then we have the ground level making up another one. The only thing that's tricky about these shapes is that the railing cutting through them changes our perception of them, makes it a little bit trickier to judge the overall shape. So you may have noticed that when I began to establish the shapes, I also put a couple of dots to indicate where the rail I think is going to be to help me visualize the shape. It's interesting, having a look at those shapes now, I can see a glaring problem that's annoying me. It's probably not annoying you as much. If you look at the right-hand side rectangle, that's got that dark window, happens to be behind it, so it stands out really clearly. And if you compare it in the photo to the one down the other end, we can see that in fact the one on the right-hand side is wider than the left-hand side one because it's closer. And so foreshortening means those shapes get narrower. If we look at my drawing, the width is pretty much the same. It's just that the height is less on the left-hand side. So I've changed the proportion, and the proportion of my left-hand one is not right. It's too wide. And so I got the shape wrong. Now, fortunately, it's not something that's super obvious, but it's important that we see these things when we draw so that we can be more alert to it the next time. So now I'm continuing to look at shapes, and if you can see on the veranda section, I did that black line as a straight line because I was looking at the gap between the top of that veranda covering and the bottom of it, the part closest to us and the part further. Now in life, if we think form, if we think three dimensions, this veranda roof moves back from the top of the columns back to the house line, to the wall of the house. But I don't want to think of it as a three-dimensional form at the moment. I want to see it as a shape. And so by drawing that straight line, it's let me see the distance between the two parallel lines there without being influenced by the fact that I know it's moving back in space. I want to forget that because that will distract me from seeing this accurately as a shape. And putting that line there helps me to focus on the fact that it's a shape that I'm looking at this point. And so as I create, if you like, the shapes, shape upon shape, it's almost like assembling a house from blocks, except that the blocks are created with ink. Now, the other really important thing, of course, is angles, because the shapes aren't actually, in most cases, they're not actually rectangles. If we were looking at this straight on, then there would be a lot more rectangles. But because we're looking at it from an angle, then we see the verticals, on a good day, vertically, but the horizontal lines now move at an angle as they move away, except on eye level. So we need to find eye level. That's where there will be a horizontal line. If there happens to be one in the architecture, there's not really in this one, so that's okay. But we look at the angles of these lines and we realize that they're all going to meet up in each left and right of the house. And that, we don't need to track those vanishing points or anything, or we certainly don't need to try and draw them on our paper. But we just need to be aware that they're there. And when we're looking at the shapes, if we're aware of the angles, that will help us to get the angles correct. Now, look what I'm doing here. The same thing. I'm looking at this roof as a two-dimensional shape. I'm trying to focus on simply the distance between one part of the shape and another part of the shape. That from the top of the wall to the bottom of the the bottom of the roof line to the bottom of that dormer window area. And it's really helpful with roofs to, I think, put lines on our reference, because roofs, especially up at this level, are such a strong three-dimensional thing. It's hard to see this roof now as a shape rather than as a form, because we have such a strong sense of that this sloping back, this large space, often fairly plain, sloping back. It's hard not to feel the slope and to let that influence how we see it, and therefore how we put the ink on the paper. Instead, I need to just see this all on two dimensions as a flat sheet of paper, and in effect with the roof I have a shape that has four lines on it. Down the bottom, up the right hand side, along the top, and then down the left hand side. The one down the left hand side, visually it's interrupted by the two dormer windows, but that's the shape, that quadrilateral shape. That's what I'm looking at, and that's the shape I want to create. And I want to make sure it doesn't go too high and that the angles are the same. And hopefully get the dormer windows in the same proportion. Now, when I'm doing the dormer windows, part of the reason I did those lines going down on the outside line of each dormer window is because I was lining them up with the columns underneath. Well, I was looking to see how they lined up with the columns on the veranda, because that helped me position where the dormer windows were going to go. At least let me see where they should be going, if my proportions generally were accurate or not. And you can see that little trick there of checking my angle to see how it goes. We can do this even if we're drawing on location as well. I like to eyeball it first, put a dot where I think the angle's going to end up, and then I check it before I put the mark using this method. And that way I get the best of both worlds. I get the accuracy of measuring the angle and sliding it across with my pen. But before I do that, I challenge myself in a way to do it just through observation. And that's an important skill to develop, because sometimes that's going to be the only option we have. And this is a way of checking to see, have I got the top and the bottom lined up? And I can see that it needs to go out a little bit more. And as you can see, my dormer window's probably slightly too high. Looking at this, it probably needed to come down a little bit rather than be smaller. that right-hand dorma and therefore the left-hand dorma as well. Now I'm aligning, I'm measuring distances, I'm measuring two-dimensional distances. I'm not seeing form, I'm not seeing these chimneys as boxes at this point. I'm seeing each side as a shape, as a two-dimensional shape that lines up with other shapes that I've drawn, and I'm now trying to put them in place. So when do we think of form again? Well, we think of form when we start to do the final line work. Now, thinking form actually affects the earlier part of a drawing for lots of subjects, such as trees, for instance, natural scenes, things that are particularly weathered and have rough, irregular edges. Form is important to know at the start for that, because I wouldn't be drawing these fairly smooth lines unless I had a subject such as architecture that does give us a lot of fairly straight, smooth lines or smoothish lines to draw. It just so happens that this subject lends itself well to the sorts of ink marks that we would use to draw shapes. But if we had something that was more irregular, such as the edge of a canopy of leaves, then a straight line or even a solid continuous line that's curved in and out isn't going to create a very realistic look. And so we have to be not just thinking shape, but also the three-dimensionality of the form. Because when we're thinking form, we're thinking of the fact that objects, when we see them in life, when we think of them as having depth, when they have height and width, but they also go back, maybe they have edges, maybe it's a curved edge that they have. We think of an apple. It moves away from us in space without any edges, but there is movement of what we're seeing. And so we need to find more subtle ways of putting the ink on the paper to capture the effect of the three dimensions, to give the feel that this is three-dimensional. And sometimes we can do that with shade and shadow, but sometimes that's not available. It's not part of what we're looking at. So the one thing I would suggest here is particularly the house next door and that mountain and those trees and those houses in the far distance on the upper left side. Pay attention particularly to how they get drawn, where I'm still thinking shape, but I've also become very aware of form, because form, thinking three dimensions, also brings into consideration of depth, of how things look different when they're closer to us than when they're very far away. And just imagine if I had a tree in front of this house and how different that tree would look and need to be drawn than the trees that we have on that ridge line in the distance. Please hit the like button if you're finding this interesting. If you like architecture, drawing architecture, I think it's a great subject. And now here you see me doing some of the detail now of the house. Now, if I've got my proportions correct, I can draw these windows as shapes as well. And they should fit and they should look pretty much the same as in terms of height and width. Now remember, I'm trying to also create the effect of form now, so I'm particularly conscious of depth lines, of when we look at something from an angle, such as we are here. Let's just look at that central doorway. We can actually see the depth. We can see the way the door moves backwards through the width of the wall, the depth of the wall, on the left side, but on the right side, because of the angle, we don't see it. So I think of those lines that indicate the depth as depth lines, and need to make sure we're always aware of what side of any windows and doors is there a depth line visible. And it's pretty obvious here, but sometimes it's not so obvious. It's an almost front-on view. But particularly if it's a long facade, the depth lines become more and more visible as we move down away from the central viewing spot. And so if we're thinking of all these things, if we're aware of how it works in theory, it's easier to notice in practice, with all the things we have to think about, what's happening, and therefore to start to draw them. And that way we start to get a stronger sense of 3 dimensions of form, of the depth and the curvature and the distance. So now just a little bit of indication of the decorative moldings. I'm sure it's plaster work, but it's meant to look like nice dressed stone blocks. Well, not plaster work, it's on the outside. It would be rendered, concrete rendering. And now trying to give an indication of the shadow that's being cast by this veranda. I think if I were drawing this now, I would actually do these lines at an angle. I think that would just create better clarity. I feel like the vertical lines are getting lost with some of the vertical lines establishing the drawing. But all the time thinking angles. All the time thinking angles. And clearly I've decided not to draw the car because I wanted this to be a study of the house. But if I were drawing the car, it's exactly the same principle. I think with cars, they're another subject where it's really important to think shape, but to draw form. And it's not so easy because we don't usually, with cars, have nice squarish shapes. We have various curved lines that often join with curves. The corners are often curves as well. And the form is often quite complex, and therefore it's more distracting than trying to see the shape. Sorry, I have a door creaking in the wind somewhere in the house. I don't know if you can hear it or not, but if you've been listening to it, I hope it's not annoying you as much as it is annoying me. But now we're really filling in some of the details, and so we're trying to get a sense now of the overall scene, where this house we want to have feel closer to us than the other things. The house is clearly the main subject, and it's therefore sitting in the nearer plane, depth of plane. But what we draw further back, we want to make clear, is further back by the way we draw it. They're still shapes, but we want to be aware of form. And it's not just the form of individual objects in our subject, but it's the form of the total scene. So it's not just that some of this house is closer than the back half of the house, but this house is closer than the neighbour's house, and both of those houses are much closer than the hill in the background, the ridge line in the background. So form is not just the form of one thing, it's the form of everything. And so we want the way we ink and put our marks on the paper to create that sense of close, of further, and of furthest. And that's why I usually like to draw the closest things first, if at all possible, because once I've drawn that, or at least I've established it with my marks, now when I draw things that aren't the closest things, I can work off what I've done so that I start to use marks that are lighter, that I can start to show less detail, and I know what I need to be lighter than. I know what I need to have less detail than. And so it lets me get the relative workings of all of this. So can you see how with those details now further back, they do sit further back very nicely. And so now I'm just wondering, what am I going to do? Am I going to indicate the corrugated iron or not? What details will I try to just create a hint of, create the effect of? So this now, if you've seen my videos of drawing the effect of detail, that's what I'm doing now. Without drawing everything I can see, I'm trying to give an indication, because that does create the weathered look, which is important for these sorts of houses. I don't want it to look like it's been newly constructed. I'm using a 0.3 Copic multi-liner pen, I think for the whole drawing. I think I did those further parts with the same pen, just very lightly. Just a little bit more to show this is the front of that house. We can just see the corner of the front. Darkening the values, these are all the final adjustments. Please hit that like button if you haven't already, and I hope this idea of bouncing between focusing on shape and on focusing on form is helpful for you. So I'm giving some indication of the corrugations here now. And a little bit of just final work. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I love drawing architecture, and I find this is the most helpful mindset to have. To be looking for shapes, but in the end I'm drawing forms. That's probably the best summary. Find the shapes, see the shapes, use the shapes in plotting things accurately, but draw the forms, because at the end of my drawing, I want us to be able to see something that looks three-dimensional, not just the main subject, but the entire scene to look three-dimensional. So why not give it a go? Look, I'll post this photo on my channel post page if you'd like to have a go. But in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, have fun.